Have you ever had, like, a truly amazing meal, and then for the next day or so, everything else just tastes, I don't know, a bit bland, a bit flat?
Oh, definitely. Or maybe you're looking at apartments.
Yeah.
You see a perfectly nice one, totally decent. Then you tour some huge, luxurious penthouse.
Mhm.
And suddenly that first place feels tiny, right?
Yeah.
Almost cramped.
Exactly. It happens all the time. It's like our internal standard just gets reset, and we don't even notice it happening most of the time.
It's remarkably consistent, isn't it?
Oh.
Our brains are constantly recalibrating. They use the most recent kind of standout experience as the new benchmark.
So what felt normal or even good can suddenly seem way worse, or maybe way better, just because of what came right before it.
Precisely.
And that, everyone, is exactly what we do here on the Deep Dive. We take your sources, pull out the key insights, and really help you cut through all that noise to get properly informed.
And today we are diving deep into this really fascinating psychological thing that affects, well, pretty much every judgment and perception you make.
We're talking about the contrast effect.
Yep. And we've got a whole stack of research here that shows just how much our context, the situation around us, shapes what we see, what we feel, even what we decide. It's pretty pervasive.
So our mission for you today is to really unpack this effect. We're going to look at when it starts literally in newborns,
Right from the beginning.
and then trace how it influences everything from how we see things, our social judgments, how we shop, even, believe it or not, legal decisions.
We'll get into the definition, look at some really key studies, and then talk about how this actually plays out in your life and, importantly, what you can maybe do about it.
Okay, let's start with the core idea then. What exactly is the contrast effect? Can you break it down?
Sure. So at its heart, the contrast effect is basically when our perception or maybe our judgment of something, let's call it a stimulus, gets significantly altered.
Altered, like stronger or weaker. Yeah.
Exactly. Enhanced or diminished. And it happens simply because we're comparing it, often unconsciously, to another stimulus we just experienced, especially if that other one was quite different.
So it's not about how good or bad the thing actually is in isolation.
Not really, no.
Yeah.
It's more about our brain's tendency, its default mode almost, to judge things relative to what's nearby or what just happened.
Right, so the small apartment isn't physically smaller after seeing the huge one, but it just feels that way in my head because of the comparison. It's like a mental shortcut.
That's a great way to put it. It's a
Yeah.
cognitive shortcut, yeah.
Yeah.
Heuristic. Our brain uses it to quickly make sense of all the information pouring in.
Instead of meticulously analyzing every single detail.
Right, it just goes, okay, how does this stack up against the last thing? It's efficient, but not always accurate in an absolute sense.
Okay, so what's going on underneath? Why does our brain do this comparing thing? What's the mechanism?
Well, it seems to be rooted in something called adaptation level theory. The idea is that our judgments are always relative to this internal baseline, like a neutral point,
And that baseline is formed by...
by our recent experiences.
Yeah.
So when our experiences change, that baseline, that adaptation level, it shifts too, and that changes how we judge the next thing that comes along.
Ah, okay. So if I'm always drinking, say, regular coffee, that becomes my neutral. Then if I try really bitter coffee...
Well, the contrast hits you hard.
Ew.
Or if you have really amazing coffee, the regular stuff might seem disappointing afterwards. Your neutral got recalibrated by the new experience.
That makes perfect sense. The brain adapts, and anything outside that new adapted state gets magnified, either positively or negatively, like the measuring stick keeps changing length.
You got it.
So let's see just how early this starts. You mentioned newborns. That seems incredibly fundamental.
It really is. There's this amazing study from 1972 by Cobre and Lipset. They looked at what they called negative reinforcement contrast, but basically, does prior experience affect value for newborns?
Wow. Okay, how on earth do you test that with babies who are just, what, a few days old?
Well, they took 25 healthy newborns, measured how fast they sucked when they were given different fluids through a nipple.
Okay.
Some just got water, some just got a sucrose solution, sugar water, basically, and others got switched back and forth, like sucrose then water or sucrose then nothing. The sucking rate showed what they preferred or how much they wanted it.
And what happened? I mean, surely babies just like sweet stuff, end of story.
Well, they definitely preferred the sweet stuff. They sucked much faster for sucrose than for water. No surprise there.
Right.
But here's the kicker, the really interesting part. When a baby was switched from sucrose to water, their sucking rate for the water dropped by half compared to babies who only ever got water.
Whoa. Half, so the water wasn't just plain water anymore. In their little baby brains, it was water after that amazing sweet stuff.
Exactly. The comparison made the water seem much less desirable. And get this, when they switched back to sucrose after the water, the sucking rate doubled compared to babies who only got sucrose.
So the sucrose seemed even better after the less exciting water. The contrast worked both ways.
Precisely. And it wasn't just about taste fatigue or something. They saw the same kind of undershoot when babies went from sucrose to no fluid compared to babies who always got no fluid.
Okay, so this is solid evidence then? Even newborns are experiencing this contrast effect.
Yeah, strong evidence for this negative reinforcement contrast. What it really means is that even from day one or day two, the value we place on something isn't just about the thing itself. It depends heavily on what came before. It suggests this comparative judgment is baked in. Really fundamental.
That's genuinely wild. So our baseline sense of good or bad or neutral is shifting from the moment we're born. Okay, let's jump from the cradle to, well, our eyes. Does this affect something as basic as seeing shapes?
It absolutely does. There's a cool study from 1998, Suzuki and Kavanaugh. They look at how we process visual shapes.
How did they test that?
They'd quickly flash a line on a screen that was the priming stimulus. Then, immediately after, they'd flash a circle, the test stimulus, followed by a visual mask to kind of wipe the slate clean. Participants just had to say what shape the circle looked like.
So, did seeing the line first mess with how they saw the circle?
Totally. The circle actually appeared stretched out or elongated, perpendicular to the way the line was oriented. So if they saw a vertical line, the circle looked wider, more horizontal.
Huh. That's weird. And was this just happening right where the shapes appeared? Like on the retina?
That's what's really interesting. No, this distortion happened even if the line and the circle were shown in different parts of the visual field. So it wasn't just a local low-level effect. It suggests it's happening higher up in the visual processing stream.
So it's not just like our eyes take a picture. There's this brief moment, like a fraction of a second, where our brain is still actively figuring out the shape, and it can be pushed around by other shapes nearby.
Exactly. They called it a labile stage of visual processing, maybe 50 to 300 milliseconds after you see something. Your perception of shape is still kind of malleable and easily influenced by context. It's like the line repels the circle in this sort of mental shade space, making it seem more different from the line than it actually is.
Wow. Okay, so our vision is more interpretive than we think. And it's not just external things like shapes. You mentioned this can affect our internal states too, like subjective feelings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hartson did a study back in 1969 looking at this with male opiate addicts. In the study, they were given various drugs, morphine, LSD, things like that, but also placebo pills or even just no drug conditions. It was all randomized, so they didn't know what was coming when.
And they just reported how they felt.
Pretty much. They used a specific inventory to rate their general subjective experience. What they were looking for was whether the feeling of normal, the no drug or placebo condition, felt different depending on what drug they'd had before.
And did it? Did having a powerful drug experience change how normal felt afterwards?
Significantly. When the no drug or placebo conditions came after a potent drug like morphine or LSD, the participants reported those experiences as being much smaller, less intense, compared to when they got the placebo or no drug condition before the potent drug.
So if you've just had this really intense experience, then plain old normal feels less normal, less noteworthy.
Exactly. It really supports this idea that even our private internal feelings are subject to contrast. Your baseline for what normal feels like shifts based on recent, more intense experiences. It's all relative, even inside our own heads.
That's quite profound, actually. And it makes you wonder, does this extend into how we judge other people or social issues like politics? Because that could have some really big consequences.
Oh, it absolutely does. There's a classic study by Dawes, Singer, and Lemons from 1972 looking at attitude judgments. They focus on the Vietnam War, which is obviously a hugely divisive issue then.
Okay, what do they do?
In one part, they got people who were strongly pro-war, the Hawks, and strongly anti-war, the Doves. They showed them pairs of statements about the war and just asked them to say which statement in the pair was more extreme.
Let me guess. The Hawks thought the Dove statements were super extreme, and the Doves thought the Hawk statements were ridiculously extreme.
You nailed it. That's exactly what happened. Hawks consistently rated the anti-war statements as more extreme, and Doves consistently rated the pro-war statements as more extreme. Statistically significant difference. But they didn't stop there.
What else?
And a second experiment, they had hawks and doves actually write statements that they thought a typical person from the other side would agree with.
Oh, interesting. So trying to get into the other side's mindset.
Kind of. But what happened was, when people wrote statements representing the opposing view, those statements were rated by neutral judges as being much more extreme than the statements the opposing group actually endorsed. People writing for the other side tended to make them sound way more radical than they really were.
So we don't just see the other side as more extreme, we actually portray them as more extreme when we try to represent their views. It's like we create these distorted caricature.
Precisely. The researchers called it a genuine social distortion. We amplify the differences. And they warned this kind of thing can be self-perpetuating and really bad for cooperation and compromise. It helps fuel polarization, basically.
That's a really sobering thought, how easily our perceptions can drive division. And this isn't just big societal stuff, right? You mentioned it happens in more mundane settings, too, like job interviews.
Oh, definitely. A study by Shu in 1978 looked right at this. They had interviewers and managers watch videotapes of MBA applicants and decide if they passed or failed. The key was they watched the tapes in different orders.
Okay, so the context who you saw before mattered.
Hugely. They found that an applicant's rating was significantly affected by the quality of the applicant they saw immediately before. For instance, one candidate was rated acceptable by 44% of the evaluators when they saw them after a really high-quality candidate. But that same candidate was only rated acceptable by 24% when they were seen right after a low-quality candidate.
Wait, hang on. 44% acceptable after a good one, but only 24% after a bad one, for the same person.
Yep. Seeing the weak candidate first made the average candidate look comparatively worse. The contrast effect was really strong.
That's a massive difference. How much did they figure this contrast actually accounted for?
They calculated it accounted for about 6.5% of the variation in the ratings, which might not sound huge, but it was almost as much as the applicant's actual qualifications, which accounted for 8.7%.
Wow. So the order you see candidates in is almost as important as how good they actually are. That's kind of scary for anyone involved in hiring.
It really highlights it as a major source of potential error. Interestingly, they found the effect was strongest earlier on in the sequence of interviews. Maybe people adjust their baseline a bit as they see more candidates.
Still, a huge potential bias. And you mentioned this even creeps into legal judgments. That seems particularly critical.
Yeah, a study by Rodriguez and Blanco in 2016 looked at how people perceive the severity of criminal offenses. They had undergrads act as mock judges.
Okay.
They first read descriptions of 4 crimes. For some groups, these were relatively severe crimes. For others, relatively mild ones. Then, everyone read about the same 5th crime, a violent robbery. They had to pick a jail sentence for that robbery from a set range.
So the question was, did reading about severe crimes first make the robbery seem less bad, or did reading mild crimes first make it seem worse?
Exactly. And they found that the participants who first read about a series of severe crimes ended up giving lighter sentences for that target violent robbery compared to the participants who had first read about milder crimes.
It's unbelievable. So the exact same crime description gets a lighter sentence just because the judge had been thinking about much worse things moments before.
That's what the data showed. Reading about minor offenses beforehand made the violent robbery seem comparatively more serious, leading to harsher sentences. It shifted their internal scale of severity.
The implications for actual courtrooms are, well, pretty significant. A judge's recent caseload could unconsciously sway their sentencing on the current case.
It really underscores how context can influence even these incredibly high-stakes decisions where we strive for objectivity. Fairness could be compromised just by the order things are presented.
That's a really powerful and, frankly, slightly disturbing finding. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something maybe more relatable day-to-day. Everyday behavior, consumer choices.
Yeah.
You mentioned class attendance. How does contrast affect that?
Right. There was a study by Howell Williams and Sem back in '79. They looked at undergrads in different classes with different quiz schedules.
Okay.
One class had no quizzes, another had frequent quizzes, and a third had frequent look-at quizzes, basically reviewing graded quizzes for credit. They just tracked who showed up on test days versus non-test days.
And what was the pattern? Did quizzes make people show up more overall?
Well, attendance on actual test days was high for everyone, like 90%.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right? But attendance on the non-test days was way lower, like 40 to 55%. But here's the contrast part. The classes that had frequent quizzes actually had lower attendance on non-test days later in the semester compared to the class with no quizzes at all.
Huh. So having lots of high-stakes test days made the regular lecture days seem less important by comparison. Like, it's not a test day, maybe I could skip.
That's the interpretation, yeah. The students learned to discriminate. The frequent high-value test days created this contrast, making the optional non-test lectures seem less crucial. The perceived value shifted because of the comparison point.
Interesting. So the structure itself created a contrast that influenced behavior. Now, this makes me think, could this effect influence something like the use of punishment by changing what feels mild versus severe?
That's a fascinating question, and Harrison and Pepitone looked into something like that. They had participants train rats using electric shocks. They had options for mild and slightly painful shocks they could use.
Okay, standard learning experiment stuff.
Right. But some groups were also shown options for moderately painful or even extremely painful shocks. But they were explicitly told they were not allowed to use those stronger ones.
So the really nasty options were visible but forbidden. Did just seeing those options change how they used the weaker, allowed shocks?
It did. The groups who could see the extremely painful but forbidden option ended up delivering more of the weaker, permissible shocks, both more often and at a higher intensity, compared to the control group who never saw the extreme option.
Wow. So the presence of the really bad, unusable option made the slightly painful one seem less bad, more acceptable to use frequently.
That's the idea. The extreme, prohibited option served as a contrast point, making the permissible shocks seem less severe by comparison, which potentially lowered the threshold for using them.
That's a really powerful effect and potentially quite concerning.
The researchers themselves pointed out the potential implications, for instance. Could the mere presence of lethal weapons potentially encourage more frequent use of less lethal tools by authorities simply because those tools seem less severe in contrast? It's a sobering thought about how context frames perceive severity.
Definitely food for thought.
Hmm.
Okay, let's move into the area where this is probably most obvious to many of us. Consumer choices. We're constantly bombarded with comparison.
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere. Priester, Dallachia, and Fleming studied something they called the background contrast effect. This is where making one choice, maybe involving a trade-off like price versus warranty on a TV, then influences a totally unrelated choice you make later, maybe about something completely different. The first decision kind of lingers in the background and sets a comparative context.
So choosing between, say, a cheap flight with no legroom and an expensive one with lots might affect how I later choose between a cheap hotel far away and an expensive one nearby.
Potentially, yes. The way you weighed the trade-off in the first decision can bleed over and influence how you approach the second. And here's the really surprising part they found.
What's that?
This background contrast effect actually gets stronger when people are trying to be more thoughtful and careful in their decision-making.
Wait, stronger? You'd think thinking harder would make you more objective, not more susceptible to this bias. How does that work?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But the idea is that when you're thinking carefully, you're actively looking for relevant information, and your brain might mistakenly flag the comparison or trade-off from the first decision as being relevant or applicable to the second one, even if it logically isn't.
So my effort to be rational makes me more likely to apply an irrelevant comparison.
In some cases, yes. Your brain is trying hard to find patterns and make connections. They also found a twist. If you make people realize that the first decision's context is totally inapplicable to the second, the effect can flip, and people might overcorrect in the opposite direction. Our brains are constantly trying to adjust based on these comparisons.
It's clear this contrast effect isn't just some lab curiosity. It's woven into almost everything we do, isn't it? Choosing restaurants, evaluating job offers, maybe even how we feel about ourselves.
Absolutely. It's incredibly pervasive. Think about sales tactics. Retailers, car dealers, real estate agents, they use this constantly.
Like showing you the super expensive model first.
Exactly. That $3,000 options package suddenly seems pretty reasonable when it's tacked onto a $60,000 car price tag. Or seeing a $500 jacket makes a $250 one look like a steal. It creates this illusion of the bargain. The value is perceived relatively.
And it hits us personally too, right? In relationships, self-esteem.
For sure. You hear people say how a really bad past relationship made their current, maybe just average partner seem like a saint by comparison.
Right. Gratitude by contrast.
Or on the flip side, constantly comparing yourself to curated images on social media or that one super successful friend can really tank your own self-worth. It makes you feel inadequate purely because of the unrealistic comparison point.
And in the workplace too, like those performance reviews you mentioned. Comparing this year's solid employee to last year's absolute superstar might lead to an unfairly critical review.
Definitely. The context of the comparison shapes the judgment.
So this is clearly happening all around us and inside us. What can you, the listener, actually do about it? How do we fight back against this bias, or at least manage it?
Well, the absolute first step, the most crucial one, is just recognizing it. Being aware that this happens is huge.
Okay, awareness first, then what? For personal stuff, big purchases, evaluating situations.
Try consciously to evaluate each option on its own merits. Ask yourself, forget the other options for a second, is this actually good value? Does this meet my needs?
Yeah.
Actively try to step away from the immediate comparison. Maybe take a break, come back later with a fresh perspective.
Reset the baseline, essentially. What about in professional settings, like that hiring example or performance reviews? Those have big consequences for others.
Yeah, there are definitely strategies. One simple one is just taking breaks between evaluations, whether it's interviews or reports. Give your mental reference point a chance to reset.
Makes sense. Don't rate 5 people back to back.
Right. Another is to rely more on objective data. Use scoring rubrics, metrics, graphs, charts, things that focus on the individual's performance against set criteria, rather than just a gut feeling compared to the last person.
Get it down on paper, make it less subjective.
Exactly. Seeking input from a third party can also be really helpful. Someone else might not have the same contrast effect biasing their view. It provides an external check.
Like getting a second opinion on candidates.
Yeah. And things like blind reviews, where you remove names or other potentially biasing info from resumes or proposals initially, can help focus on the substance.
Taking out those easy comparison points.
And breaking down complex information, chunking it, can help too. Assess smaller pieces individually rather than getting overwhelmed by a massive comparison. Finally, just training people, making teams aware that this bias exists, and talking about strategies to mitigate it can make a real difference.
So to wrap up then, the contrast effect. It's this really powerful, often invisible cognitive bias. It's constantly nudging our perceptions, our judgments, our decisions, because we're wired to compare things relatively, not absolutely.
And it's there from day one, literally from infancy all the way up to complex social judgments and professional decisions. It's fundamental to how we process the world.
But understanding how it works, knowing its impact, that really empowers you, doesn't it? It gives you the tools to approach things more critically, more independently.
Absolutely. It helps you spot when external factors, those comparison points, might be shaping your thoughts or actions without you realizing it. It allows for more conscious, more objective choices.
So, here's something to think about as we finish. If our perceptions are so easily swayed by context, by comparison, how much of what you experience day to day as normal or good or extreme is actually an absolute quality of the thing itself?
And how much is just
Mm.
a product of what you happen to compare it to recently? And maybe what responsibility does that give us individually, but also collectively, to think about the contexts we create, the comparisons we set up for ourselves and for others?
Really makes you think.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.